tradition of unfree speech came in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. One might say the first really successful exercise of free speech was Martin Luther's exactly 500 years ago, when he launched the Reformation with a challenge to the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church that in previous centuries would simply have led to his being burnt at the stake as a heretic. Why was Luther successful where previous critics of the papacy had failed? The answer lies in the realm of technology. It was the fact that the printing press existed that allowed Luther's message to go viral, as we would now say, to spread across Europe. In multiple editions of his sermons and other writings, Luther's ideas spread in ways that had not been possible when the only mode of reproduction of the written word was the careful hand copying of a literate elite. The printing press was not controlled by anyone. It was, in our own terms, a distributed technology. Johannes Gutenberg did not own all the printing presses in Germany. And that was why, ultimately, the Reformation network could defeat the Roman Catholic hierarchy in at least half of Europe. When you think about it, and I urge you to think about it rather than chat to your neighbor, when you think about it, yes, I'm talking about you two. Yes, you two. When you think about it, everything you study here can be traced back to a succession of intellectual revolutions beginning 500 years ago that spread despite the opposition of authority. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the revolutionary ideas that produced the American and then French republics, the Industrial Revolution. These revolutions spread because nobody could control the printing presses and nobody could control the networks of correspondence which united intellectuals all around the world. And yet, the great era of free speech that produced Voltaire and his great observation that he might disagree with you, but he would defend to the death your right to say something he disagreed with, that era ended. And the world reverted during the 19th and 20th centuries to a time of hierarchical dominance and generalized censorship. The world of our grandparents was not a world of free speech. The mid-20th century, in most countries, was a time of really quite rigorous censorship. Most rigorous in the totalitarian states, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, but also surprisingly extensive even in those societies that insisted they were free. Why was that? Again, it was because of technology. The technologies of the 19th and 20th century, the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, the cinema, the television, lent themselves much more than the printing press and the letter to centralized control. And by the middle of the 20th century, it was possible for Joseph Stalin to control the speech of every Soviet citizen through a network of censorship and surveillance that essentially killed the possibility of freedom itself. We should be thankful that the totalitarian project of the mid-20th century ultimately failed. Failed for reasons that Hayek, after whom your chair is named, Axel, so well understood. The centralizing authority cannot optimally allocate resources, and in the absence of freedom, there cannot be innovation. It was not accidental that the internet was invented in the United States and not in the Soviet Union. Oh, the Soviets had a project to create their own computer network. It was, in fact, established as a project in Kiev, the capital of what is now independent Ukraine. But the Soviet internet, or internet, as it should perhaps be called, failed because central control prevented the rapid proliferation of distributed and independent nodes, as the Department of Defense allowed to happen in the United States. I now understand, as I didn't before, I grew up in a new age of technologically driven freedom. After Watergate, the press broke free of the constraints that had been imposed on it in the Western world in the mid-20th century. Meanwhile, in the Soviet system, centralized control broke down completely to the point that the system itself collapsed, and with it the Soviet Union too. The internet in its early phase, in the 1980s and 1990s, held out the promise of libertarian nirvana. We were going to be able to say whatever we liked in cyberspace to whomever we liked. John Barlow's manifesto proclaiming the independence of cyberspace is almost comical to read now, but at the time, in the 1990s, it seemed plausible. The independent realm of cyberspace would achieve the ultimate in human freedom. Universal connectivity, free communication for all of humanity. And yet, even as that nirvana glimmered within reach, a cold wind was blowing, and it was blowing above all on university campuses. This was not a wind from above. It was not the state that mandated political correctness in classrooms and on campuses. On the contrary, this movement emanated from faculty and was supported by at least some students. Even as we have fantasized about an age of free speech online, in reality, in many universities in the Western world, free speech has been in retreat since the 1980s. And the most recent developments that I behold on university campuses give me real and grave concern. Hate speech. Hate speech is the 21st century term for heresy. And if you are accused of hate speech as a professor on most American campuses today, you'd better look out. Because the process of no platforming, of online harassment, will begin the minute they suspect you of being a political heretic. It is a strange combination of the Puritanism of early 17th century New England and the excesses of the Cultural Revolution in Mao's China. It's also, for some, a kind of career. Witchfinder was a kind of career in many parts of Europe and even Massachusetts in the 17th century. The witchfinders of our time seek political witches, heretics, online, and the trials occur on Twitter and Facebook. This is a deeply disturbing trend. And what's most disturbing about it is that it seems to spread outwards from the United States to British universities, to European universities, and who knows, perhaps also to South American universities. Beware. Beware the witch finders. Beware the new denouncers of heresy. They pose a profound threat, not just to free speech, but to free thought. I don't know if you've ever tried thinking without speaking. It's a lot less satisfying, and it really limits your impact on other people. I find myself thinking more and speaking less. It has a chilling kind of effect to be accused of racism or homophobia, to have yourself called a white supremacist in the London Review of Books. It makes you a little uneasy when such accusations get repeated and repeated, when they make an annual appearance every time your enemies amongst the witch-finders decide to have a go at you. No, I'm not going to stop saying the things that I have said that are politically incorrect. I still believe that on balance, the benefits of the British Empire exceeded the costs. That is hate speech in the eyes of a generation of post-colonial scholars, but it seems to me to be empirically verifiable economic history. Yes, there are things that John Maynard Keynes said that were wrong. Yes, there were things that President Barack Obama did that were wrong. And even worse, yes, there are some things that President Donald Trump has done that are right. I continue to publish such heretical views, but I do it each week with a heavier heart, with a feeling of dread, wondering, will the witch-finders come after me this week? Will I have to increase the security budget for me and my family this month? When the atmosphere becomes as toxic as it has become in some parts of this country, of the United States, I should say, when scholars like Charles Murray face physical assault when they give speeches as invited guests at, for example, Middlebury College, something very unpleasant is happening. And the most unpleasant thing about it, ladies and gentlemen, is the response that I myself feel. The response to self-censor. The response to play safe. The temptation to retreat into private life, into the safety of one's own study. Yes, it turns out that internal exile is possible also in the West, though we used to think it was something that only happened to intellectuals in communist countries. Let me conclude by asking what we can do to turn this toxic tide. Well, we as academics and students can uphold a culture of tolerance and civility in an atmosphere of open exchanges of views. Could you wake that guy up? Just give him a nudge. Hey, free speech isn't free. What can we do? Take the earphone out. What can we do? We need, it seems to me, somehow, to make a collective effort to restore civility, but also openness to our intellectual life. We need to defend the right of free speech, except when it is used to attack free speech. It was Karl Popper who said we should tolerate everything except intolerance. I constantly come back to those words as I contemplate our present situation. Not everything can be said. You wouldn't want every detail of your personal life to be on the internet unless you'd already posted it there yourself deliberately. We wouldn't want every detail of our lives to be online in a kind of ultimately transparent world. We don't want pedophilia, and we don't want terrorist propaganda. There are some limits to what can be allowed. Nobody can be a complete free speech absolutist. But I favor the thinnest of censorship and the thickest of skins. Just because you're offended, and you may have been offended by my waking you up, doesn't mean I'm going to shut up. When people say to me, I'm offended, my attitude is, diddums. I don't know how that translates into Spanish. And yet I hear this argument all the time. Oh, I'm so offended by what you say. That is verbal violence. No, it's not. There's violence and there's words. It's different. I mentioned earlier that I grew up in Glasgow, where insult is the common currency of dialogue. We were taught, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. What happened to that? When did we become so hypersensitive that we couldn't take a joke? I began with Martin Luther. I'll end with him.